Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Daily Word. I'm glad you could join me for our time together. Thanks for setting aside these few minutes of your day to join me, as you always do, for our conversation through Scripture and what it means for us and how we use it as I have described, I think, building blocks for our lives. So thanks for being part of that and for sharing these days and these conversations with me. Today is Daily Word number 628, and we end the week together. This week we've heard a couple of times from the book of Ecclesiastes some powerful wisdom words that are given to us, and I think they help us to live better in those kinds of ways. So from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, which is the chapter we know the best, but verse 17 this morning, at the end of all of that, there is a time to, and it's God that does this. We hear these words. I thought to myself, God will judge both the righteous and the wicked, for there's an appropriate time for every activity, and there's a time for judgment for every deed. So Solomon recognized, as I think we all do, that all the decisions we make and the action that we take, they lead to lots of things in our lives. And Solomon recognizes that all the actions that we take, all the things that we do, all the words that we say, they lead us, as Solomon says, to a day of judgment, when God decides and gives meaning to everything that we do in life. Solomon says there's a judgment for every deed, and that we should examine ourselves and the appropriate activities that we take part in. For me, God will judge in this text means that God will decide. God will decide the purpose of all things. God will decide and give perspective and meaning to all the things that we have experienced. And I think this text reminds us, at least it does for me, that we should, if we listen to all of what Solomon says in the book of Ecclesiastes, we should live our lives seeking God's perspective. We should live our lives now by faith, that we would pursue a life well lived, and that we should figure out ways, to best interact in life, to best live in the world, to seek God with all that we do. We don't always understand it. We'd like to, if you're like me, you like to be in control. You like to have your finger on the pulse of all of these things. We're recognizing this text, and Solomon recognizes in all of these words of wisdom that we're finite, and we don't have the ability to seek the infinite truth in all things. So we're left with a couple of choices, right? We're left with trying to figure it out and to create and recreate the purposes of our life and the things that we do in our own image, or we have the choice to set aside and trust that God would guide us through our lives. So Solomon, in this text, reminds us that we have to change our time horizon, that by faith we find meaning. By faith, we find our trust in God. There is a time and a purpose for all things, but we don't always know them until much later. And so Solomon calls us to be obedient to God, to trust in God's commands, knowing that God in our lives makes perfect sense. We're reminded that when we engage with the uncertainties of our life through faith, then we find in the midst of that wisdom and enjoyment and peace and gratitude. And then when we live that way by faith, it extends our view and our horizon in a much greater way. And I got to thinking about that this morning, about how we live our lives. And here we are, we're approaching Thanksgiving and all that entails, and everywhere you go, are you ready for Thanksgiving? I had to go to the doctor this morning, to my orthopedic doctor, and we were talking about it. He says, how are you going to fix your turkey? I'm like, well, I just put it in the oven. Well, he's a deep fry kind of guy, and that's always made me nervous. And we talked about that, and he said, well, I don't need to see you for 6 months. That's the longest I've ever gone. 6 months, because he thinks I'm doing well, and I am doing well. And so I said, okay. And when I went to check out, I said to Michelle, who works there, so March. She said, Jim, really? That long? I'm like, I know. And I got to thinking about that in terms of our perspective of life. There's a time for everything, a time to do things. And as we live our lives by faith, as we trust in God in all the circumstances, our horizon of faith expands, and we can see beyond it. And we know that God works God's best in us and through us when we trust and live by faith. Now, it's not always easy, of course. We have our own set of setbacks. We don't always get it right. But we're reminded in Ecclesiastes that there's a time for everything, and that we should live our lives trusting that God's going to move in us and shape us in amazing ways. And that's how I think we're called to live, even in the season of Thanksgiving, right? Where we're just thankful for all that we have, knowing that God plays a part in this, and that we really don't have to control everything. We just have to simply trust in the God who moves and shapes us. So that's a good word for the end of this week for us as we've joined together. Thanks for being with me this week. Know of God's love that surrounds you. Know my love for you. I look forward to seeing you Sunday morning at 10:15 as we share in worship together. And we're going to have lunch, and we're going to decorate the church following. And then join me here again Monday morning at 10 o'clock. Have a great day and a great weekend.